way, and so was Catherine.
Prince William unexpectedly pulled back the velvet.
Prince William just shattered years of carefully guarded palace silence with a single devastating sentence. During a routine interview about his charity work, a reporter asked a direct question about his relationship with the king. Instead of delivering the usual scripted answer about family unity, William looked directly into the camera and let the truth slip out. His blunt, unexpected words instantly sent Buckingham Palace into an absolute state of panic. The carefully managed public illusion of a united royal family is officially over. The unscripted answer that changed everything. Prince William adjusted the small lapel microphone attached to his dark blue suit jacket. He sat in a plain leather armchair inside a temporary broadcasting studio in Cape Town. The room was small, hot, and crowded with television equipment. Outside the building, hundreds of people were waiting for the final events of a major global environmental summit. A veteran television reporter from a major British network checked her notes before looking up. She asked a final, standard question about whether King Charles had sent a personal message of support for the project. William did not offer the usual polite nod. He leaned forward, looked directly into the camera lens, and stated that his father's priorities had shifted completely away from the work of the younger generation. The studio grew completely silent as the crew realized the weight of what had just been recorded. A senior press officer from Kensington Palace dropped her digital tablet onto a nearby table. She frantically signaled to the camera operators to stop filming, but the red recording lights remained on. William kept his composure, refusing to correct his statement or soften his tone. He added that the institutional support they had been promised at the beginning of the year had simply vanished. This single, blunt admission stripped away decades of carefully managed public relations. It confirmed that the long-rumored rift between the sovereign and his heir was no longer a private family matter. The interview was part of a scheduled media drive to promote the latest round of international funding for global conservation projects. The official itinerary for the visit had been approved by both households months in advance. The paperwork filed with the Foreign Office indicated that the trip would focus entirely on environmental diplomacy. Instead, William used the global platform to expose an entirely different reality. His words were broadcast to millions of homes within 20 minutes of the recording's conclusion, completely derailing the planned evening news cycle in London. The hard facts behind the tension had been building since 2024. Internal ledger books for the royal estate showed a massive restructuring of the family's private finances. The duchy funds, which historically supported the public work of both the monarch and the Prince of Wales, had been subjected to a new set of strict royal warrants. Charles had introduced a centralized management system that required his personal signature for any expenditure over £50,000. This bureaucratic change effectively froze several independent community projects that William had spent years developing. The financial restrictions had created a quiet bottleneck within the administration. Documents leaked from a closed-door meeting at Clarence House revealed that William's team had submitted 3 separate funding requests for youth housing initiatives. Each request had been returned with a red stamp, indicating that the funds had been diverted to the ongoing restoration projects at Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. The king wanted to prioritize the structural legacy of the historic monuments, while his son wanted to invest in modern public engagement. The clash over the budget had reached a complete standstill by the summer. The mystery centered on why William chose this specific moment in South Africa to go public with his frustration. He had historically avoided any public criticism of his father, always maintaining a united front during previous family crises. The sudden shift in strategy suggested that something more significant had occurred behind the scenes just before he boarded his flight. A private letter had arrived at William's residence on the morning of his departure. The document contained a formal directive from the king's private secretary, outlining a new plan to reduce the number of working royals even further, directly affecting the future roles of William's own children. This directive threatened the long-term stability of the succession plan that William had been preparing for. He viewed the letter as a direct breach of a verbal agreement made during the transition of power following the passing of the late Queen. That agreement had guaranteed William complete autonomy over his household's public strategy and the future planning for his family. By attempting to dictate the roles of the next generation without consultation, the king had crossed a line that William felt compelled to defend publicly. The immediate reaction from Buckingham Palace was a mixture of panic and confusion. The director of royal communications locked himself in his office on the first floor, refusing to take calls from the International Press Corps. The phone lines were buzzing continuously as journalists demanded to know if the prince's comments reflected a formal split in the institution. The palace media team tried to draft a statement claiming the remarks had been taken out of context, but the raw video footage was too clear to deny. William had spoken deliberately, with full knowledge of the consequences. The digital fallout was instantaneous and massive. Within an hour, news websites across the world had analyzed every word of the interview. The public narrative shifted away from the environmental summit entirely, focusing instead on the breakdown of the relationship between the two most senior men in the monarchy. Financial analysts noted that the public dispute could affect the fundraising capabilities of the royal foundations, as corporate donors disliked institutional instability. The carefully built reputation of a smooth, modern transition of power was dissolving in real time. Charles was staying at Sandringham when the broadcast aired. Palace aides reported that the king watched the interview in his private study, sitting in silence as his son criticized the institutional direction of the crown. He did not immediately call his advisors or demand an emergency meeting. Instead, he requested the complete transcripts of William's recent speeches from the past 6 months. He wanted to see if there were other hidden criticisms that the palace media monitoring team had missed during the busy autumn schedule. The tension between the two households had also begun to affect the daily operations of the royal staff. Employees at Kensington Palace reported a complete freeze on communication with their counterparts at Buckingham Palace. Joint planning meetings for the upcoming spring tour of Australia were abruptly cancelled. Aides were told to pause all work on shared schedules until further notice. The two courts were operating as entirely separate entities, with no shared strategy or unified voice. William returned to his hotel room in Cape Town after the media briefing concluded. He refused to issue any clarification or follow-up statement to the press. His staff packed their bags for the return flight to London, knowing they were heading directly into a massive institutional storm. The prince had drawn a clear line in the sand, forcing the palace to confront the deep ideological divide that had been hidden behind the royal pageantry for years. The true extent of the devastation was not just about the money or the schedules. It was about the fundamental disagreement over what the modern monarchy should stand for in the 21st century. Charles believed in tradition, continuity, and the preservation of the institution's historic framework. William believed the crown could only survive if it became an active, modern force for social change, even if that meant breaking away from the old rules. What will happen when William's flight lands back in London? The quiet battle over the crown's future. The commercial airliner touched down at Heathrow Airport under a gray sky. William walked straight past the usual VIP arrival lounge to a waiting black SUV. His private secretary sat in the front seat, holding an encrypted mobile phone that had been ringing since the vehicle left the tarmac. A secure digital file had just been transmitted from the Treasury office in Whitehall. The document contained the newly drafted sovereign grant allocations for the upcoming fiscal period. It showed an immediate 15% reduction in the operational budget, specifically earmarked for the Prince of Wales's administrative staff. This financial penalty was the direct consequence of the South Africa interview. The official ledger book of the royal household records that funding adjustments require a joint sign-off from the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Keeper of the Privy Purse. However, a private rider had been added to the bill at the last minute. This clause redirected those specific funds toward the emergency maintenance of the structural foundations at Balmoral Castle. The official reason given was an unexpected drainage leak beneath the historic ballroom floor. But William's team knew the timing was not coincidental. The reduction in funding immediately threatened several long-term commitments. William had personally guaranteed £5 million of funding to community land trusts across Cornwall to build affordable rural housing. The project had already broken ground on its first site in November of the previous year. If the palace withdrew the administrative backing now, the local councils would be forced to halt construction entirely. This move would leave the future king publicly exposed to claims of breaking his promises to the electorate. A quiet mystery emerged regarding a missing signatures log from the Sovereign Grant Committee meeting held on Thursday afternoon. The minutes showed that 3 senior Treasury officials had raised formal objections to the sudden reallocation of the funds. They pointed out that shifting public infrastructure money to private royal estates could trigger a parliamentary inquiry. Yet, the final authorization went through anyway, under an emergency royal prerogative stamp. This specific stamp had not been used for a financial matter since the 1970s. The person who pushed the emergency authorization through was a veteran courtier named Sir Michael. He had served 3 generations of the family and currently held the title of Permanent Lord-in-Waiting to the King. He possessed the unique authority to bypass standard committee votes during moments of national or institutional crisis. Sir Michael had acted on a direct, verbal instruction given from the King's private apartments during the late-night strategy session following William's broadcast. This administrative maneuver confirmed that the King was willing to use the full weight of his constitutional powers to curb his son's independence. Charles believed that the Prince of Wales was establishing a parallel court that directly competed with the main household for public attention and corporate funding. The centralized financial control was intended to force William back into a subordinate role, ensuring that all major national initiatives remained under the direct banner of the reigning monarch. William's response to the financial freeze was swift and highly unusual. He instructed his legal team to review the original 1427 charter of the Duchess of Cornwall estate. The ancient founding document stated that the revenues generated by the agricultural lands and commercial properties belonged exclusively to the heir to the throne to maintain his public works. The text contained no provision allowing the reigning sovereign to intercept or redirect those funds for its state maintenance outside the duchy's geographic borders. This legal countermove raised the stakes of the conflict exponentially. If William pushed the issue, it would force a public court battle over the interpretation of historic royal property laws. The government would be dragged into the middle of a constitutional dispute between the king and the future king. The Prime Minister's office immediately called for a private briefing with both households to prevent the legal paperwork from being formally filed with the High Court. The tension within the family expanded to include the wider circle of working royals. The king's sister, Princess Anne, attempted to act as a mediator between the 2 camps. She arranged a private lunch at her country residence in Gloucestershire to bring the father and son together away from their respective press teams. She knew that if the public dispute continued through the winter, it would permanently damage the public standing of the institution ahead of the next major state opening of Parliament. The lunch did not happen. William declined the invitation, stating through his diary secretary that his schedule was fully committed to the ongoing housing project inspections in the Southwest. He refused to sit down for informal family reconciliations, while the structural funding for his public initiatives remained blocked by the palace bureaucracy. He wanted a formal, written retraction of the budget cuts before he would agree to any private meetings with his father. Meanwhile, a second mystery developed involving an encrypted digital drive that had been delivered to the palace security post by an anonymous courier. The drive contained the unedited audio recordings of the internal strategy sessions held by Charles's advisors during the South Africa trip. The leaked audio revealed that several senior aides had actively discussed leaking negative stories about William's staffing structure to the Sunday newspapers to distract from his environmental speeches. The discovery of the audio drive proved that the hostility was not just limited to policy disagreements. It involved a coordinated campaign by elements within the king's household to actively undermine the public reputation of the heir to the throne. The revelation completely destroyed any remaining trust between the 2 staffs. William's team immediately changed their internal encryption protocols and barred all Buckingham Palace employees from entering the private offices at Kensington Palace. The public line remained completely silent as both sides dug in for a long institutional standoff. The official royal website continued to display images of the king hosting foreign ambassadors, while William's social media channels focused entirely on his visits to local charities. But the separation was clear to everyone working within the system. The 2 courts were no longer communicating, and the future of the crown's public strategy was caught in the middle of a cold war. Charles remained isolated at his estate, his advisors warning him that cutting his son's budget too deeply could provoke an even more devastating public statement. The king was facing a growing dilemma. He could continue to enforce the strict financial restrictions to protect his traditional authority, or he could compromise to prevent a full constitutional crisis that could threaten the survival of the modern monarchy itself. What will happen when the Prime Minister attempts to broker a formal truce between the two households? Palace aides scramble behind closed doors. The plastic wheel of a shredding machine whined inside room 104 on the ground floor of the palace. A senior press officer threw a stack of rejected press release drafts into the bin. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. On the desk, 3 separate television monitors played the exact same news broadcast on loop. The headline ticker across the bottom of the screen read that the royal family was facing its biggest structural crisis in a generation. The communications team had spent 4 hours trying to write a single statement that both households would sign. They had failed. The main point of contention was a specific word in the second paragraph. The King's team insisted on using the phrase administrative misunderstanding to describe the funding dispute. William's private secretary rejected that wording immediately via a secure email sent from his mobile phone. He stated that his office would only agree to a statement that explicitly recognized the independence of the Cornwall project funds. Without that admission, the Prince of Wales would refuse to sign any joint declaration of family unity. This standoff left the palace public relations department completely paralyzed. Under the official rules of the royal household, no statement concerning the heir to the throne can be issued without his explicit consent. If the King's press team went ahead and published a solo statement from Buckingham Palace, it would confirm to the media that the two courts were actively fighting. The journalists waiting outside the gates on the Mall were already reporting that a major administrative split had occurred. A curious incident happened at the side entrance near Birdcage Walk just after 3 in the morning. A secure Royal Mail van arrived to deliver a handwritten package addressed directly to the King's private secretary. The delivery log showed that the package had originated from a private legal firm based in Bristol. The couriers refused to leave the documents with the main security desk. They demanded that the duty sergeant call the private secretary down to sign for the paperwork physically. The package contained a formal legal notification concerning the tenancy agreements on several duchy-owned farms. The documents proved that William's legal team had already begun restructuring the land titles to prevent the palace from intercepting the rental incomes. By altering the legal framework of the tenancies, the prince had effectively blocked the King's treasury from accessing the funds at the source. This was a direct escalation that went far beyond public statements or media briefings. The mystery remained how William's legal team had prepared such a complex set of property documents so quickly. Altering duchy land titles typically required months of historical research and formal land registry filings. A junior clerk in the palace archives discovered that someone had requested the original land maps back in September of the previous year. The electronic tracking log showed that the files had been checked out using a temporary research pass assigned to a law student. This detail revealed that William had been preparing for a potential financial conflict long before the South Africa interview took place. He had anticipated that his father's centralization plans would eventually target his independent project budgets. The law student who pulled the files was actually a fully qualified real estate attorney working undercover for the prince's private estate. The entire legal defense had been mapped out and stored on a secure server, waiting for the right moment to be deployed. The King's private secretary brought the legal documents straight up to the royal apartments. Charles was sitting at his writing desk, reading through a stack of state papers that required his signature before the weekend. He studied the land registry filings for several minutes without speaking. The text showed that his son had successfully exploited an old loophole in the Crown Lands Act of the 19th century. The loophole prevented the reigning sovereign from interfering with the revenue of the heir apparent if the funds were tied directly to local employment initiatives. The legal reality forced a sharp change in the palace strategy. The communications director was told to stop working on the joint press release entirely. Instead, the palace issued a brief, one-sentence announcement, stating that the king would be undertaking a private retreat to his estate in Wales for the next 7 days to focus on his upcoming watercolor exhibition. It was a classic administrative evasion tactic designed to remove the king from the immediate glare of the London press corps. The retreat did not stop the internal pressure. William's team immediately capitalized on the king's departure by booking 3 high-profile public appearances for the prince over the coming weekend. He would be visiting a youth center in Manchester, a housing development in Leeds, and a community farm in Birmingham. Each event was strategically chosen to showcase his active engagement with modern social issues, contrasting sharply with the king's traditional retreat. The media coverage shifted immediately in William's favor. The major broadsheets published long analysis pieces, contrasting the active work of the Prince of Wales with the quiet isolation of the king. Financial analysts pointed out that William's independent funding model allowed him to bypass the traditional palace bureaucracy entirely, making him a more effective public figure in the eyes of the modern public. The institutional balance was tipping, and the palace aides knew they had lost the first round of the media battle. The situation became even more complicated when the head of the palace security detail reported a major leak within the internal communications network. Several private text messages between senior aides had been intercepted and published by a foreign news website. The messages contained highly critical comments about William's management style, with one advisor describing the prince's team as an independent republic operating inside the royal system. The leak confirmed that the animosity between the two staffs had reached a point where daily collaboration was no longer possible. The Cabinet Office stepped in, assigning a senior civil servant from the Home Office to act as an independent mediator between the two households. The government wanted to establish a temporary administrative protocol to ensure that official state business could continue without being disrupted by the family feud. The mediator arranged a mandatory virtual meeting for Friday afternoon, requiring both private secretaries to present their updated operational calendars for the next 6 months. The objective was to create a strict separation of public duties, ensuring that the King and the Prince of Wales would never be in the same city on the same day. The monarchy was being systematically divided into 2 separate regional zones to prevent further public friction. William accepted the regional division without objection. His team had already secured the financial independence they needed to fund their projects through the winter. The prince had proven that he could use his legal and media teams to defeat an attempt by the king to restrict his authority. The public facade of family unity had been completely destroyed, replaced by a cold, functional partnership managed by government officials. But the temporary protocol did not resolve the deeper institutional question that hovered over the entire administration. With the king retreating to Wales and the prince expanding his independent network across the north of the country, the central authority of the crown was fracturing. The aides in room 104 began packing up their files, knowing that the rules of the royal succession had been permanently rewritten during the night. The weight of an interrupted succession. The wooden floorboards of the gallery cabin creaked under the weight of a heavy iron fireplace basket. William threw a handful of dried kindling onto the small flame, his hands stained with gray soot. He stood up slowly, stepping back toward the small window of his private hideaway on the edge of the estate. Outside, the Welsh rain beat a steady rhythm against the dark slate roof. On the table behind him lay a sealed velvet folder containing the 2025 Regional Assembly reports. Embedded deep within the secondary annex was a new legislative draft regarding the automatic transfer of royal properties during an extended medical leave of absence. This specific piece of legislation altered the timeline of the modern succession. Under traditional rules updated in 1937, a regent could only be appointed if the sitting monarch was completely incapacitated by illness. However, the new draft introduced a highly ambiguous clause regarding voluntary administrative handovers for specific geographic sectors. The paperwork showed that the king's advisors had quietly lobbied the Home Office to keep the sole signature power in London, effectively preventing the Prince of Wales from executing his new regional policy models without direct parental oversight. The introduction of the voluntary handover clause created immediate panic within William's legal team. They realized that if the king signed the document, it would legally invalidate the independent autonomy William had just secured through the Cornwall Land Registry filings. The new rules would retroactively classify his housing initiatives as state-managed programs, subject to direct veto by the king's private secretary. This administrative trap was designed to quietly dismantle the parallel court William had spent the winter building. A mystery surfaced when an audit clerk checked the print register for the government legislative database. The system recorded that the text of the draft had not been authored by a civil servant in Whitehall at all. It had been uploaded to the secure server from a terminal located inside the private medical wing of a clinic in Marylebone. The file metadata indicated the final edits were saved on January 14th. a date when the senior royal households were supposed to be observing a strict administrative pause due to family health treatments. The discovery introduced a troubling question into the heart of the palace crisis. The person who had authorized the remote access to the government database was a senior legal consultant named Lord Carrington. He was a trusted personal friend of the king, who specialized in constitutional law and royal inheritance structures. He had been granted emergency access to the state files under the pretext of updating the king's personal will during his medical treatment cycle. Instead, he had used that privilege window to construct an institutional barrier against the heir apparent. This revelation changed the nature of the power struggle entirely. It proved that the attempt to restrict William's authority was not just a reaction to the South Africa interview. It was part of a long-term institutional strategy designed by the king's closest allies during a period of intense personal vulnerability. They feared that if William gained too much public momentum during the king's recovery period, the traditional authority of the reigning monarch would be permanently eclipsed by the popularity of the modern successor. William did not waste time with private protests. He acted immediately by scheduling a direct, unannounced meeting with the Prime Minister at the official countryside residence in Buckinghamshire. He arrived without his standard security convoy to avoid alerting the palace press pool. He laid the Marylebone metadata files directly onto the cabinet table, pointing out that using a private medical window to alter public constitutional documents violated the strict separation between the family's personal affairs and state legislation. The legal threat worked. The Prime Minister recognized that if the story of the hidden medical wing database entries leaked to the Sunday newspapers, it would spark a massive public scandal regarding the manipulation of Parliament by royal courtiers. The government could not afford to be seen enabling a hidden power struggle while the country faced economic challenges. The Prime Minister gave a firm assurance that the voluntary handover clause would be permanently removed from the legislative draft before it reached the floor of the House. The victory for William was significant, but the tension within the palace walls remained dangerously high. The king returned from his Welsh retreat on Tuesday morning, his face pale but his expression stubborn as he arrived at Buckingham Palace. He refused to see his son, choosing instead to hold a formal meeting with the keeper of the privy purse to review the annual travel expenses of the Kensington Palace household. He was looking for any minor administrative violation that could be used to justify a public reduction in William's official staff. The internal Cold War began to affect the preparation for the upcoming Commonwealth Summit in New Zealand. The official programs required a joint photograph of the King and the Prince of Wales to symbolize the continuity of the realm. However, William's diary secretary informed the organizing committee that the prince would only participate in the photograph if his independent housing report was included in the official summit briefing packs. The stalemate over the photo opportunity lasted for 3 days, forcing the printer to delay the production of the official booklets. As the weekend approached, a second leak emerged from the palace switchboard. A digital recording of an internal phone call between two senior dressers revealed that the Queen had ordered several historic portraits of the late Princess of Wales to be moved from the main gallery to a secondary storage room in the basement. The official reason given was routine frame restoration, but the timing felt like another calculated attempt to clear the building of Diana's visual legacy before the next major state reception. The removal of the portraits provoked an immediate reaction from the palace staff. Several long-serving housekeepers threatened to contact the museum trustees, pointing out that the historic artwork was part of the national collection and could not be moved to a basement storage facility without formal conservation certificates. The small-scale rebellion among the domestic staff showed that the internal divisions had spread from the high-level legal offices down to the daily operational departments of the household. William used the domestic dispute to reinforce his boundary. He publicly announced that his foundation would provide a permanent financial grant to the National Portrait Trust to fund a global tour of the late princess's archival photographs. By moving the images out of the palace and into public galleries across the country, he bypassed the Queen's restrictions entirely, ensuring his mother's memory remained highly visible to the public regardless of internal palace politics. The king sat in his private study on Friday night, watching the television news report on the new photography exhibition. He knew that every attempt by his inner circle to restrict his son's influence had only resulted in William gaining more independent public authority. The traditional tools of royal discipline, budget cuts, legal maneuvers, and administrative delays had completely failed to work against a successor who was willing to challenge the old rules in the open. The temporary protocol established by the government mediator had successfully separated the two courts geographically, but it had failed to resolve the fundamental crisis of authority at the heart of the state. The monarchy was now operating under a fragile dual court system, with two senior royals pursuing entirely different visions for the future of the institution. The lines had been drawn, and the inner circle knew that any minor incident during the upcoming spring schedule could trigger the final, devastating break. The ultimate shift in royal power. A black canvas cloth dropped to the floor of the gallery room on Saturday morning. It revealed a striking full-length black and white portrait of Princess Diana laughing during an overseas tour in 1993. The exhibition doors at the National Portrait Gallery opened promptly at 9 o'clock. Within minutes, the main hall was crowded with hundreds of people holding pre-booked entry tickets. The event was entirely funded by William's private foundation. It stood as a direct challenge to the palace basement storage order issued earlier that month. The physical turnout at the gallery provided a definitive metric of public support. The booking website for the ticket office crashed 3 separate times due to the high volume of traffic from users across Britain. Official visitor logs for the first weekend recorded a higher attendance rate than any state-sponsored royal event held since the coronation. William had successfully moved his mother's visual legacy out of the palace corridors and placed it directly into the public sphere, making it completely impossible for the traditionalist faction to hide. This public triumph caused deep frustration inside the offices of the Sovereign Grant Committee. A senior accountant noticed that William's team had not used a single penny of state-allocated funds to organize the exhibition. Instead, the entire project had been financed through a new, independent corporate sponsorship deal signed with a green energy conglomerate based in Scotland. This meant the king's advisors could not use their traditional financial oversight powers to cancel or restrict the tour. William had created a self-sustaining funding model that bypassed the crown's strict financial gates. The media strategy failed completely. The major television networks assigned their senior royal correspondents to the National Portrait Gallery, sending only junior local reporters to cover the dinner at Lancaster House. The evening news broadcasts dedicated their opening 5 minutes to William's speech about preserving his mother's modern, humanitarian values. The Queen's event was reduced to a brief mention at the very end of the program, demonstrating that the palace's traditional public relations machinery was no longer effective at controlling the public narrative. William did not mention his father or the Queen during his opening remarks. He stood in front of the massive 93 portrait and stated that the true measure of an institution's survival was its willingness to remain accessible to the people it served. He added that legacy was not something to be locked away in private rooms or protected behind historic walls. It had to live out in the open air of the modern world. The audience responded with a sustained round of applause that echoed through the high-vaulted galleries. The modern monarchy was now operating under a permanent, functional dual-court system that could not be reversed. William had secured his financial independence, protected his mother's legacy, and forced the government to guarantee his operational autonomy. The public facade of family unity had been replaced by a realistic, business-like arrangement between two entirely separate operations. The rules of the royal succession had been rewritten not by a change in the law, but by the practical execution of modern power. What do you think about Prince William's strategic move to use an independent archive to defend his mother's legacy? Did he make the right choice by bypassing the traditional palace system to protect his autonomy? Or does this permanent split damage the long-term survival of the monarchy?